This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On June 17th, Professor Paul Robinson of the University of Ottawa spoke to our Security Studies Roundtable on deterring Russian aggression.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody. Good morning. When the Canadian government announced that it was going to send 200 troops to Ukraine to train the Ukrainian National Guard, it said that it had two objectives. The first was to deter Russian aggression, and the second was to enable the Ukrainians to fight more effectively. And underlying these objectives are three assumptions. First, that the war in Ukraine is primarily a product of external intervention by Russia. Second, that the war in Ukraine, but if the West does not act firmly towards Russia, then Russia will be emboldened to carry out further aggression. And third, that the causes of the Ukrainian army's defeats are to be found in the poor level of training of their troops. So what I want to do today is to examine whether these assumptions are correct, and broadly speaking, with the proviso that a lot of this is highly speculative, the answer is probably no. Now, this isn't to deny that Russia is involved in Ukraine. Clearly, it's up to its necks in Ukraine, and its activities can hardly be considered friendly from a Ukrainian point of view. But it is a mistake to see Ukraine's problems as primarily external in origin, and to think therefore that the solution lies in pressuring the relevant external actor, that is Russia, to change its behavior. Indeed, there is a serious danger that by doing so we can make matters worse. And to illustrate this, I'm going to do this in a slightly unusual way. What I'm going to do is take 10 personalities who are mixed up in this war and use them as a lens through which to examine what is going on, what Russia is up to. Okay. And I think at the end you'll discover that the picture is more complicated than is generally made out to be. So my first personality is a rebel militia woman who goes by the call sign of Lada, like the car. And there's nothing particularly special about her. I just picked her out in order to represent the 30,000 to 40,000 Ukrainian citizens who have taken up arms against their own government. Now, the authorities in Kiev regularly deny that they are fighting their own citizens, and they insist that this is not a civil war, but a war against Russian invasion. This is inaccurate. Western journalists who have spent time with the rebel units universally report that while there are Russians and other foreigners among them, 80 to 90% of them are locals. In other words, 80 to 90% of these militiamen are Ukrainian citizens. Now, Lada here was among the first to join the militia in the town of Kramatorsk in Donetsk province last year. As she describes it, Russian volunteers did turn up to join them, but not until about a week or so after they had already started seizing buildings. Furthermore, these Russian volunteers were not soldiers of the Russian army, but civilians. And this was the pattern elsewhere. The uprising began as a form of local protest against the overthrow of President Viktor Yanukovych in February 2014, and outside forces only intervened gradually and in an informal way. Now on Lada's arm, you can see a badge, which is the badge of the so-called Russian Orthodox Army. This was just one of dozens of such groups which appeared last spring. Now, if this had been a centrally coordinated rebellion masterminded by some outside force, one would have expected to see a vertical hierarchy in some central authority. Instead, the rebellion in its early days was organized horizontally. That is to say, there was a vast plethora of local militia with organizations like the Russian Orthodox Army and others like Vostok, Aplot, Varyag, Prizrak, numerous Cossack groups, and actually there were scores of these groups. So at this stage there was no central authority, no single organization, no controlling will. The form the rebellion took, at first, rather defies the idea that it was orchestrated directly by the Russian government. And basically, in spring last year, the situation was one of anarchy. In the West, the takeover of government buildings in eastern Ukraine was seen as a repeat of what happened in Crimea with what some people call little green men, and the Russians call polite men, who were actually Russian soldiers taking the lead. But this isn't what happened at all in Donetsk and Lugansk provinces. If you watch films of these takeovers, it's very clear that this was not an orderly process like in Crimea, but really was a sort of mob rule. So what I'm going to do now is show you about 2 minutes of a film taken by the Vice News organization, which actually illustrates one of these takeovers. And here it is here. The idea is to give you some sense. Which will give you some sense of the process by which these takeovers took place. Those are obviously not Russian soldiers.
Честные люди местные говорят. Какие переговоры? Слово так! Никто тебя не говорит! Вообще никто тебя не показывает. Видишь, и вот порой. Давайте возвращаться в город, между прочим, начальника милиции. На каком основании он запрашивает какие-то подразделения непонятные? Ты откуда? Откуда ты? Ну скажите, кто вы, ребята? Российская Галичина, Национальная гвардия, СБУ. Я всем прям влазил. Если они здесь были, уже никого нет. Мы сейчас едем на поле, смотрим, где учреждение отдела на похищение людей, смена поста. Владимир, где оружие? Никаких ремонтов, просто нету ничего. Мы выбираемся в город. Их территории, их баз, они прикуплены. В городе нашего никто. И мы берем пленных человека милиции и милицию. Они выезжают, и мы просто разрушаем город.
Okay, we can't actually see. Unfortunately, what this guy then says is, let's go, he says, let's go into town and take over the police post. And then they'll go, yeah! And then they go off to town and take over the police post. Unfortunately, the subtitles gave out before we could actually see that. I quite like that film, and Vice News is actually very good. It's done some excellent filming because it really shows the anarchic nature of what was going on at this time. So why were these people protesting, and why did people like Lada here take up arms? And to answer those questions, I'll now introduce my second speaker, Ina Kukurudza. Now, Ina was a social worker in the city of Lugansk. On 2nd of June last year, she was standing outside the rebel-occupied administration building when a Ukrainian Air Force plane fired several rockets at it. The blast blew off Ina's legs and she died shortly afterwards. A passerby filmed her death on his cell phone. It's extremely unpleasant. So I'm not going to show the film, but the point is that within hours this film was posted on the internet and was being watched by thousands of people in eastern Ukraine and Russia. And it wasn't the only one. There were films of the Ukrainian army shooting civilians in Mariupol on 9th of May, in Krasnoarmeysk on 11th of May, and so on. And these were very widely viewed, and even those who didn't watch them knew about the events. So if you want to know why people took up arms, that is to a large degree why. And if you watch interviews with militiamen and you hear them being asked, why did you take up arms? The answer is nearly always the same, which is, I live here, I didn't ask these people to come here, I'm defending my home. That's what they say. Now, at the start of the uprising, the number of protesters in eastern Ukraine was actually quite small. As in most insurgencies, the bulk of the population stood to one side. But as time has gone on, more and more of it has been driven into the arms of the insurgents. Thus, at the time Ina Kukurudza was killed, the rebel force was perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 strong. By the end of June, it was maybe 10,000. By the end of July, 20,000. By the end of August, 30,000. And it's now even more. In a dynamic many of you will recognize from studies of other insurgencies, the more force the army has used, the more people have joined the rebellion. Also important is the way that the Ukrainian authorities reacted to Ina's death, which is that they denied any responsibility. The official Ukrainian story is that a rebel anti-aircraft missile struck the building after being diverted by an air conditioning unit, which is not only extremely implausible, but due to various videos of the event can easily be proved to be untrue. There is no doubt that Ina died as a result of a Ukrainian airstrike, but the government simply denies it. Indeed, it regularly denies killing any civilians whatsoever. The official spokesman of the Ukrainian army, Colonel Lysenko, has repeatedly claimed that the army does not shell residential areas. Again, this is easily shown to be untrue. Simply put, the Ukrainian authorities are in denial about the effects of their operations, and this is a serious cause of their problems. Now, so far I've emphasized the local roots of the conflict in Ukraine, but it is true that outside forces became involved from an early stage. Most prominent among them was the third personality I'm going to show you, Igor Strelkov. Strelkov turned up in the town of Slavyansk in mid-April with an armed group of about 50 men. Previously, he had been a colonel in Russian intelligence services, and for many this was the missing link between the rebels and the Russian government. Strelkov, it was said, had been sent by Russian intelligence to stir up and lead the rebellion. But had he? Well, you know, because it's secret, we can't tell. But he himself has a different story. He says he was in Crimea when the uprising began, and a group of people came from Donbass and asked him to help them, at which point he gathered some men and went. And the Russian intelligence services, he says, may have known what he was doing and didn't do anything to stop him, but they weren't the ones who sent him, and they never gave him any orders. Indeed, once he was in Slavyansk, he acted like a loose cannon. He's a very eccentric man, and if the Russian intelligence services ever were controlling him, they lost control of him pretty damn quick. For instance, while in Slavyansk, Strelkov regularly issued communiques denouncing the Russian government for failing to send him any weapons. As we shall see, Strelkov and those associated with him do not regard the Russian government as being a friend of the rebellion. This, though, does raise, if Strelkov was complaining that the Russian government wasn't sending him any weapons, that raises the question of where they got their weapons from. Now, at first, they got them through seizing stores of the Ukrainian army and police and the Ukrainian secret service, the SBU. Subsequently, they captured an enormous amount of equipment from the Ukrainian army in battle. The most thorough analysis of this issue was a report written by some Australian and British weapons experts in November last year, which looked at as many pictures of rebel weapons as they could find and then tried to work out where they came from. And this is the cover of the report. It's called Raising Red Flags. And its conclusion, I'm not going to read the whole thing down at the bottom there, but the final line is that although some weapons came from outside, the majority of arms and munitions documented in service with the separatist forces have evidently been appropriated from the Ukrainian security forces and their installations within Ukraine. This report, though, only covers the first few months of the war, and really from early August, things began to change. And the dynamic is quite interesting. At first, when the rebels were informal militias fighting a sort of guerrilla war, they were able to survive by capturing weapons and equipment. But once they got hold of a large amount of them, and tanks and artillery pieces and multiple rocket launchers and things like that, they began to merge their disparate militias into something resembling a professional army. They ran into sort of problems because you needed fuel for these vehicles and you needed a lot of ammunition for all these artillery guns and so on. Okay? And you needed someone to train you how to use them. It's one thing to capture a Grad rocket launcher, it's another thing to actually use it. Okay? And once you had an army, you needed staff officers who could coordinate units, do logistics and stuff like that. And all of that had to come from Russia. And eventually, from sort of August onwards, it did. But it came with a price. And the price was a loss of political freedom. So previously, the rebels were not dependent on Russia, but now they were. And the quid pro quo for Russian support was that rebels had to moderate their political demands. The key point then is that initially the rebellion operated beyond Moscow's control, but from about August onwards, Russian supplies increase, and Russia begins to gain some control over them. And the purpose of military supplies was as much political as military. It is the tool Russia uses to gain some leverage over the rebel leadership in order to moderate its behavior and bring it in line with Russian wishes. And we shall see an example of how this dynamic worked in a couple of minutes. Now, at the beginning of July 2014, Strelkov's troops fled Slavyansk and withdrew to the city of Donetsk. And shortly afterwards, my next personality, former Ukrainian Defense Minister Valerii Geletei, turned up at Slavyansk to inspect the abandoned rebel stronghold. Here's another film from Vice News, which shows him giving an interview. I'll go back, hang on. So here he is giving an interview to the Vice News people, who are very good, I think. And this is Simon Ostrovsky from Vice News, and here he is on the edge of the town of Slavyansk once Strelkov has abandoned it.
And the Minister of Defense is here to tell us what the situation is. We're going to head back into Slavyansk, which I haven't been in since I was kidnapped.
Mrs. Geletei.
Силы підрозділів антитерору задіяні в повному об'ємі. І на сьогоднішній день ви бачите звільнені міста, місто Слов'янськ, місто Краматорськ. Починається відновлювати нормальне життя в цих містах. Ви бачили картинку в місті Слов'янську, нічого там немає страшного. Ми маємо на сьогоднішній день не знищені інфраструктуру міста Слов'янська, міста Краматорська. Також хотів би наголосити.
Okay, so I show that just to again emphasize the point I was making earlier about the somewhat state of denial of Ukrainian authorities about the effect of the military operations, which we see very clearly revealed in Geletei's statements there. Now, the interesting thing is that the capture of Slavyansk was viewed by many as a great victory for the Ukrainian army, but just a couple of days later, this article appeared. Okay? And for those of you who don't read Russian, the headline says, General Staff of Ukraine, we are on the eve of catastrophe. And then the star of the article at the bottom says, a source in Kiev communicates that a mood of panic reigns in the Ukrainian General Staff. From day to day, they expect a catastrophic defeat in the south. And this was right. And to see why, one just has to look at a map. Now, the blue and yellow area is the provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk, and the sort of pink area in the middle is the area controlled by the rebels in June of last year. Slavyansk is up in the sort of top left of that pink area, and Donetsk, to which Strelkov withdrew, is down the sort of bottom left of the pink area. Now, in June, the Ukrainians had tried to cut the rebels off from Ukraine by advancing along that strip which is marked in yellow, south of Donetsk and Lugansk. So, and they ended up with this long corridor, you can see in yellow there, about 60 kilometers long, but at its narrowest point between Russia and the rebel-controlled areas, it was only about 10 kilometers wide. And at that narrowest point, the rebels controlled the key terrain, which is a big hill known as Saramagila. And from the top of Saramagila, the rebels could see everything which was going on in that corridor. Okay? And they were able to interdict supplies moving down it. The result was that before very long, the guys at the end of the corridor didn't have any supplies at all, okay, and were in rather a bad position. Now, you don't have to be a military genius to work out what Strelkov was going to do once he arrived in Donetsk from Slavyansk with his 2,000 men, and that is try to cut off that corridor, surround the Ukrainians in it, and destroy them. And that is, of course, what he proceeded to do. Now, in the article I showed you, it says that the Ukrainian General Staff warned its political and military masters that this was what was going to happen. And it recommended that the Ukrainian army withdraw from this entire sector. But the article then goes on to say that Geletei and the politicians rejected this advice and insisted that the army stand and fight where it was. The result was the catastrophe which the General Staff had predicted. The rebels cut the corridor, and eventually 500 Ukrainian troops fled over the border into Russia as part of a deal whereby they could surrender to the Russians, not the rebels. But in return, they had to abandon all their equipment. So the end result was the Ukrainians lost all the territory anyway, but they also lost hundreds of men and a huge amount of equipment. It was a military disaster. But it was a military disaster which was not only predictable, but actually predicted. It was entirely avoidable, okay, and could have been avoided if the advice had been followed to withdraw in good time. Now, this and other defeats, therefore, are very much a product of strategic level misjudgments. Okay. Canada's training mission in Ukraine relies on improving the ability of the Ukrainian army at the tactical level. But it doesn't matter how much of that we do. If the strategic level leadership remains poor, it won't make a blind bit of difference. And the evidence is that it is very poor. Now, the Ukrainian army's defeat in this corridor was really very badly reported in the Western press. In fact, basically wasn't reported at all. But it was reported by rebel and Russian sources, one of which was my next personality, Igor Ivanov, who at the time was head of the political department of the rebel army of the Donetsk People's Republic. Ivanov is head of an organization known as ROVS. Okay? ROVS, David looks astonished, but it's true. That ROVS was founded in 1924 by General Wrangel. It was the veterans organization for Russians who had fought in the Civil War on the white side of the White Armies. So Ivanov here is the successor of the Whites. And as such, he hates the Reds, which means he hates the Soviets, and he's also deeply nationalistic. And for that reason, he thoroughly dislikes Vladimir Putin, because Putin is a former Soviet KGB officer and therefore a Red. Okay. Now this became clear when a Russian emigre newspaper published an article with a picture of Ivanov and the headline saying, "The head of ROVS, Ivanov, with Strelkov against Putin." And Ivanov didn't like some things about this, and that's a picture of him there. He then took time off from fighting in Slavyansk and penned a letter to the editor in which he says, "Putin isn't a traitor of national Russia, he is simply its ancient enemy." Now, we often have the impression here in Canada that this rebellion was mere, these were mere stooges of the Kremlin from the word go, but here we have the head of the political department of the rebel army calling Putin an enemy. So clearly the dynamic of this relationship is a bit more complicated. And clearly also from the Kremlin's point of view, this was not a desirable state of affairs. Okay, so in August last year, Moscow decided to do something about it, and that brings us on to our next personality, Vladislav Surkov. Once deputy head of the presidential administration in Russia, Surkov is the man who has been put in charge of the Ukrainian file. Roughly speaking, Kremlin watchers divide the Russian government into hawks, which is, the security services, the army, conservatives and nationalists, and doves, which is liberals and oligarchs who want to get back to having good relations with the West and sending their kids to school in England and stuff like that. Okay. And Surkov is seen as the key dove in Putin's administration. And many nationalists regard him as the head of a fifth column, which is stabbing the rebels in Donbass in the back at every available opportunity. Now, I can't say whether this is true or not, but the fact that many Ukrainian rebels believe this is an indication that, at least of how they view their relationship with the Kremlin. Anyway, in mid-August of last year, the heads of both the rebel Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics resigned. And then, too, did Igor Strelkov. And in Strelkov's case, it is clear that his resignation was unwilling, and the person he blames for it is Surkov. According to Strelkov's supporters, Surkov was preparing a peace deal with Donetsk oligarch Rinat Akhmetov, which was then scuppered when Strelkov arrived in Donetsk. And Surkov then got his revenge by firing Strelkov. And this may or may not be true again, but it's clear that Moscow had a hand in these changes in the rebel leadership. And the answer, why did they do this? Well, the answer appears to be twofold. First, people like Strelkov and Ivanov were hardline Russian nationalists. Actually, they're monarchists, but they're really quite odd. And they gave the impression that given a chance, they'd march on Kiev and restore the Russian Empire. And this was not what Moscow wanted to do. Okay. Rather, Moscow wanted to negotiate an end to this war. And that required more moderate leaders. Second, if there was to be a negotiated end to the conflict, then someone had to centralize authority in the rebel-controlled areas to ensure that this huge plethora of militias would actually all follow whatever peace deal was made, which couldn't be done if you had lots and lots of differentiated groups. But the rebel leaders had been very bad at centralizing authority, so new leaders were needed. And although we don't know for sure, what seems to have happened is that Surkov gave them an ultimatum, which was, if you don't resign, your rebellion will get no help at all from Moscow. But if you do, the assistance will increase dramatically. So they had to resign. Okay. And this marked a significant turning point in the conflict. So until then, until mid-August, Moscow had not been in control of events. But now, from mid-August onwards, it begins to try to get this in its hand and to rein the rebels in. And Russia adopted essentially a twofold strategy. First, get control of the rebels, so as to be able to persuade them to accept any peace deal which was made, and secondly, coerce the Ukrainian government to offer such a deal. And this explains the enormous increase in Russian military assistance to the rebels in mid-August, which culminated in the incursion of units of the Russian army into the country for the first time, which then defeated the Ukrainians at Ilovaisk in around 24th of August. And the purpose of this incursion was not to conquer territory, but rather really to give the Ukrainians a kick in the teeth to force them to the negotiating table. And this explains why on 3rd of September, when the rebels were on the verge of assaulting the major port of Mariupol, they agreed to a ceasefire. It is absolutely clear that the rebel leaders did not want to cease fire. You know, they were winning. Who ceases fire when they're winning, right? So why did they cease fire? Well, the only explanation is that Moscow told them to. So why did Moscow tell them to? Well, because it didn't really want the rebels to win. Okay? What it wanted to do was a very limited objective of forcing Kiev to the negotiating table, and that had been achieved, and therefore the rebels had to stop. Now, unfortunately, the ceasefire didn't last. Full-scale fighting resumed in January of this year, and then peace talks took place again in Minsk in February. And at this point, Surkov resurfaces. The story goes that after Putin had reached agreement with Hollande and Merkel, they summoned the rebel leaders and said, sign up, and the rebels said no. They were about to win another major military victory at a place called Debaltsevo, so they thought, why would they cease fire? So at this point, apparently, Putin sends Surkov to the rebel leaders' room and to nobble them and say, sign up. And eventually, after some further complications and with huge reluctance, the rebels agreed. Okay. And then 2 weeks ago, it is said, and again we don't know for sure, but it is said that Surkov turned up in Donetsk and had a huge shouting match with the leader of the rebel Donetsk People's Republic, Alexander Zakharchenko. And again, we don't know the full story, but Zakharchenko's habit of saying that Donetsk will never rejoin Ukraine might well be the reason Surkov went and shouted at it. So what all this shows is that Moscow's position is much less hardline than that of the rebels. Indeed, the only reason why the rebels are willing to consider any sort of compromise is because Russia is pressuring them to do so. So the story of the rebellion is not one in which Moscow was controlling all the strings from the very beginning, but rather one of which a rebellion which Moscow has been trying to get control of, over time, in order not to separate Donbass from Ukraine, but in fact the opposite, to stuff it back into Ukraine. This strategy, however, has failed because the Ukrainian government refuses to compromise in turn. Okay? Now it leads me on to my next personality, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko. Now, there's a lot I could say about Poroshenko, but what I'd like to focus on here is his role in the peace talks in Minsk in February and the defeat in the same month of the Ukrainian army at Debaltsevo. When the first ceasefire came into effect in September last year, the Ukrainian army occupied a long salient sticking into rebel territory, and you can see it on the map there in green in the sort of middle of the map, pointing downwards. Okay, so the pink territory is rebel, and the green territory is Ukrainian controlled. And once the ceasefire collapsed in February, it was fairly obvious what the rebels would try and do. I mean, you don't, again, have to be a military genius to work out rebel strategy, and that is attack either side of that salient, okay, try and cut it off and destroy all the units within it. The Ukrainian position at Debaltsevo was untenable because it was just one road in and out, and it was being shelled all the time by rebels. Okay, so the logical, sensible thing to do would have been to withdraw. But just as Ukraine's leaders had refused to withdraw when threatened with encirclement in the past, so they did so again. At first, the soldiers in Debaltsevo were able to hold on, but by the time the peace talks began in Minsk, the only major road, I mean, you could still sort of get through the fields, right? But the only major road in and out of Debaltsevo had been cut by rebel forces. The troops there were in a hopeless position. And with this in mind, at Minsk, Putin told Poroshenko that he should accept a new ceasefire line further to the rear, and then, as part of the peace agreement, the troops in Debaltsevo and all their equipment could be taken out under OSCE escort as part of the ceasefire, thereby ensuring that all the troops and equipment is fine. Poroshenko refused. His army, he said, was not surrounded. The front line should remain where it was. This stubbornness had fatal consequences. The rebels kept pressing the attack, and aware that their position was hopeless, on the night of 17th, 18th February, the remaining Ukrainian forces broke out of encirclement. Most of them escaped, but there were heavy casualties in the process, and vast amounts of equipment were left behind, including some radars the Americans had given them. So, you know, if you give equipment to the Ukrainians, it does have a horrible habit of ending up in the hands of the rebels. All of these casualties and all of this lost equipment could have been avoided had Poroshenko been willing to withdraw. And again, this highlights the extent to which Ukraine's defeats are not a product of poor individual soldiering, but of errors of leadership at the highest level. Now, these errors are political as well as military. From the capture of Debaltsevo to today, the front lines have not significantly changed, but there have been important political developments, and one of them is connected with my eighth personality, Vladimir Lenin. What's Lenin got to do with this, you may wonder? Well, since the revolution last year, people have been putting down statues of the former Soviet leader across Ukraine as part of a campaign to rid the country of symbols of its communist past. This campaign culminated with the passage of a law in May this year which prohibited the use of any Soviet symbols and required the wholesale renaming of towns, streets and buildings to eliminate all references to Soviet leaders and the Communist Party. In terms of ending the war in Ukraine, this law is a terrible one. In Donbass, Soviet nostalgia is quite strong, and a massive destruction of Soviet symbols is seen as an assault on the people's history and identity. Take the city, for instance, the city of Donetsk. It has a Lenin district, a Kalinin district, and a Budyonny district. It has Lenin Avenue, Ilyich Avenue, Alexander Ulyanov Street, Maria Ulyanova Street, Kalinin Street, Kribyshev Street, Frunze Street, Kirov Street, 18th Party Congress Street, Red Guard Street, Budyonny Street, Budyonny Partisan Street, Proletarian Street, Red Proletarian Street, Engels Street, and many, 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 many more, which are based on the names of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party, and communist leaders. The law passed by the Ukrainian parliament prohibits all of these. Okay? If Donetsk was ever to rejoin Ukraine, they would have to rewrite their entire heritage. Okay? So this law is an enormous barrier to reintegration. At the same time as passing the law banning communist symbols, the Ukrainian parliament also passed another giving official status to veterans of Ukrainian nationalist organizations who fought against the Soviet Union in the Second World War. Furthermore, this law states that it is a criminal offense to denigrate these organizations. Now, one can have a long debate about whether these organizations really were Nazi collaborators, but the fact is that the people of eastern Ukraine certainly view them in that way. The Soviet struggle against the Nazis is a crucial part of the personal identity of the people of Donbass. This law is therefore absolutely anathema. Okay. In terms of reuniting the country, it is totally counterproductive. Okay. But sadly, it is all too typical of the ineptitude of Ukrainian authorities. Instead of thinking about how they can put their country back together, they just keep throwing up more and more barriers to reintegration. Switching direction a little bit, my ninth personality is politician Oleg Tsaryov. In another significant political development, a couple of weeks ago, Tsaryov declared that the so-called Parliament of Novorossiya had ceased to operate. Tsaryov is a former member of the Ukrainian Parliament for the previous ruling party, the Party of Regions. After the revolution last year overthrew then-President Viktor Yanukovych, Tsaryov announced that he would run as a candidate in the forthcoming Ukrainian presidential election. However, while on campaign, he was beaten up several times, his home was burnt down, and he received death threats. Okay. One of them conveyed to him by the governor of Dnipropetrovsk, Mr. Kolomoisky. Eventually, he fled to rebel-controlled areas. Once he joined the rebellion, Tsaryov became chairman of the so-called Novorossiya parliament. Now, Novorossiya, or New Russia, is an area covering the provinces of eastern and southern Ukraine. And the parliament really wasn't a parliament, it was just a group of self-appointed representatives of various parts of that region. And their purpose was to turn the idea of Novorossiya into a reality and thereby reshape Ukraine into a loose confederation of which Novorossiya would be one part. It is not clear how much support the idea of Novorossiya ever had in the Russian government. At one point, it seemed that some officials quite liked it, but at the end of last year, the resignation of the official reputed to be most favourable to it, a man named Boris Rapoport, was interpreted by Kremlin watchers as a sign that the concept was out of favour. If nothing else, it was unrealistic because the rebels don't actually control most of this area, and so you could see Tsaryov's decision as simply an acceptance of reality, but I think it goes beyond that, because if the Kremlin had liked this idea, it would have encouraged him to keep on going with it anyway. Okay, so the dismantlement of the Novorossiya parliament seems to show that Russia is not interested in extending its control further than Donetsk and Lugansk. Some commentators claim that Russia wants to capture what they call a land bridge to link its territory with Crimea. The dismantlement of the Novorossiya parliament would suggest that this claim is mistaken. It also means that the argument that Russia must be met with a firm hand in Donbass in order to deter it from expanding further rests on weak foundations, because Russia is not actually interested in expanding further. Indeed, as the story of my final personality, Denis Pushilin, illustrates, Russia isn't interested in expanding even in Donbass. In fact, it wants Donbass to rejoin Ukraine. Previously almost entirely unknown, in April last year, Pushilin became first head of the rebel Donetsk People's Republic. He later handed over this position to somebody else. Now he acts as the Republic's representative to the contact group, which consists of Russia, Ukraine and the OSCE, and which is meant to help facilitate an agreement to end the conflict. From the start, Pushilin has made it clear that his preference is for Donetsk to join the Russian Federation. Yet last week, he gave the contact group a set of proposed amendments to the Ukrainian constitution, which included a statement that the provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk were inseparable parts of Ukraine. So what is going on? The February agreement in Minsk included a clause that the Ukrainian government should negotiate constitutional reform with the representatives of Donetsk and Lugansk to recognize the special status of those provinces. According to the provisions of the agreement, the constitution has to be amended in this fashion by the end of 2015. In line with this, therefore, the rebels have put forward their suggestions as to what the constitutional amendment should be. And these proposals are actually quite modest. Donetsk and Lugansk will be inseparable parts of Ukraine, but will receive special status which will involve the devolution of authority over matters such as land resources, agriculture, cultural institutions, policing and language. Overall, the proposals are quite moderate, and there's nothing in them which could be considered objectionable in any number of Western states which devolve power to local authorities. So as a foundation for negotiations, they're not bad. The problem is, though, that the Ukrainian government isn't willing to negotiate. It immediately denounced the proposals and declared that it would never talk with the rebels. Meanwhile, after tabling these proposals, the rebels started backtracking. The day after the suggested amendments became public, the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, Alexander Zaharchenko, declared that he could not envision Donetsk ever becoming part of Ukraine. And then Pushilin himself said pretty much the same thing, thereby contradicting the document he himself had handed the contact group. In an interview, Pushilin explained his behaviour by saying that while he and his colleagues didn't really actually want what they had proposed, the Minsk agreement requires that there be negotiations over constitutional reform, and so in order to abide by the agreement, they thought they'd better present something. In effect, they're sort of going through the motions. Now, that's not of itself a bad thing. In any peace negotiation, you want people to go through the motions because it's better than having them shoot at one another, and the very process of going through the motions may actually result in something. But the key question is why Pushilin bothered, and it's not because the Ukrainians are forcing him, nor is it because the French and the Germans who initiated the Minsk process are forcing him either. The only plausible explanation is that the pressure to make these concessions is coming from Moscow. In other words, the rebels' proposed amendments to the Ukrainian constitution don't represent their own wishes, they represent those of the Russian government. If that is so, then it shows that what Russia wants does not involve seizing Ukrainian territory and is not about destabilizing Ukraine. Rather, it involves putting Ukraine back together. So to conclude, the war in Ukraine is a manifestation of a crisis of legitimacy caused by the forcible overthrow of President Yanukovych last year. Its roots lie primarily within Ukraine rather than outside. The protests in eastern Ukraine, which followed Yanukovych's fall, led to a total collapse of state authority in that region and an anarchic situation which nobody controlled. Rather than orchestrating everything from the start, Russia has largely been reacting to events and trying to establish some form of control over the rebellion in order to find a way to reintegrate the rebel areas back into Ukraine. This requires centralizing authority in the rebel republics and persuading its leaders to moderate their demands, while also coercing the Ukrainian government to compromise. Now, it's not wrong to talk of Russian aggression in Ukraine in that Russia is supplying the rebels and Russian troops have been present in that country. However, it is a mistake to view the conflict in Ukraine entirely through the lens of Russia. By externalizing Ukraine's problems and regarding them as a result of Russian actions, we miss the fact that the root of the problems and therefore the solutions to them lie within Ukraine. Deterring Russia is a somewhat futile process because Russia isn't actually interested in seizing Donbass or establishing a land bridge to Crimea or causing trouble in the Baltic states or anything like that. On the contrary, Moscow appears to want Donbass back in Ukraine and to want a restoration of stability. Moreover, we are fooling ourselves if we think that training Ukrainian troops will somehow solve Kiev's military problems. Those do not derive primarily from deficiencies at a lower level, but from incompetence at the highest level. Now, although at the moment moderates like Surkov appear to be dominant in the Kremlin, there is no guarantee that this will continue forever. If Kiev continues along its current path, Moscow's patience may eventually run out, and it may decide to move in a more aggressive direction. But we shouldn't imagine that by backing Kiev we can somehow deter this. It is more likely that by doing so we will actually provoke Russia rather than deter it. And on that sad note I conclude, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.